Of course, again, our friend and very familiar face working together with ASEAN. So I would like to invite Dr. Mary Lisa Dacanay, the president of the Institute for Social Entrepreneurship in Asia. So her presentation, as you see on the screen, will focus on social enterprises as innovators toward building back fairer, and that is the keyword, fairer amid COVID-19. So, Dr. Mary, you may have the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sita. Good afternoon, everyone. And my topic directly addresses the concern of articulated by the DSG about people-centered recovery and Dr. Fennell's call for bottom-up solutions. No? So you may be asking some of you who are not familiar with social enterprises, what are they? Well, they are actually hybrid organizations. And sometimes they are seen as social mission-driven businesses, but sometimes they're also seen as the trading segment of the civil society sector. They're sometimes micro, small, medium, and large, and they come in various legal forms from cooperatives, associations, foundations, stock for-profit corporations, and limited companies, non-stock, non-profit corporations, and partnerships, as well as single proprietorships. So let me just go to my next slide, please. So just before the pandemic, social enterprises were being seen by the UN system, UNESCAP, as actually accelerators of the SDGs. Before COVID-19 happened, we were about to co-convene and launch, as well as develop social entrepreneurship SDG acceleration platforms. And this was in recognition of the important contribution of social enterprises and the potential that social enterprise multi-stakeholder platforms can have as game changers for the SDGs, especially in addressing SDGs that were actually retrogressing, such as the SDG on equality. Next slide, please. But of course, COVID-19 happened, and what COVID-19 did was to actually introduce, of course, setbacks with the social enterprise sector. And in the Philippines, where we did a social enterprise survey, we found that 96% of social enterprises experienced some to a major downturn. And in terms of sales and revenues, about one-third of them declined their sales by 100%. No? Of course, the others declined in different ways in various levels. No? But the effect of COVID-19 on social enterprises, next slide, please, was actually differentiated. And the reason why it was differentiated was because of certain internal and external factors. Some internal factors, for example, include the level of social enterprise maturity and sustainability, including the diversity of income sources and extent of digital and ICT integration prior to COVID-19. Also internal factors such as the nature and extent of partnership and relations with resource institutions and governments, as well as the level of leadership and organizational agility and entrepreneurial management competencies, including the capacity for managing change and innovation. These were some of the internal factors that actually impacted on a differentiated impact, no? That caused a differentiated impact. And among the external factors that caused a differentiated impact was the nature and the type of the product or service, or the value chain and economic subsector where the social enterprise was situated, so that if you were in ecotourism or you're operating a restaurant or a cafe, no, you were totally devastated. But in other sectors, like for example, farming communities that were producing palay or rice, who sold their rice to local government units for relief, actually were not affected by the pandemic. Another external factor was the nature of the market and the distance from sources of inputs, as well as the location and access to infrastructure support, including digital infrastructure. But I just wanted to show that a number of internal and external factors impacted on the way that social enterprises were affected. And of course, as a result, the poverty sectors that they also served. No? Next slide, please. So the more vulnerable social enterprises have have closed or stopped operations, but those, and there are a big number that have become sustainers, even as they were affected by the pandemic, have adopted measures and mechanisms to immediately respond to their drastically changed situation. They are rebuilding and pursuing innovations towards recovery, and they're reconfiguring their social enterprise models or pursuing their pre-pandemic social enterprise models that have been proven more relevant now. No? And common to all the social enterprises that sustain their operations is their strong commitment to put the needs of poverty sectors first the best way they can. And just to show you the breadth and scope of social enterprise initiatives in response to the pandemic in Southeast Asia, we did, next slide please. We did a webinar series where we featured 10 social enterprise responses across Asia. And those in Southeast Asia, for example, included fair trade enterprises that were actually producing, who transformed their craft communities to become producers of personal protective equipment, such as face masks, including eco-friendly face masks. In Indonesia, for example, Dompet Duafa has a community-based health has a community-based health program, and their hospitals for the poor actually were in the forefront of serving COVID-19 cases among the poor. In Vietnam, Center for Social Initiatives Promotion was in the forefront of providing services to the social enterprise sector, and they showed a model for digital transformation amid COVID-19. No? And in Thailand, many of those involved in ecotourism and had cafes and restaurants, they actually transformed their models to become community-based delivery systems for food and basic needs, utilizing ICT and social media. And in the Philippines, where there have been empowerment strategies that have effectively assisted small producer communities, they actually demonstrated food secure and resilient communities amidst COVID crisis. No? But that's just to give you a sense of some of the initiatives of social enterprises in response to COVID-19. On the whole, what we've seen among social enterprises, next slide please, is that they've showed inspiring models and responses to the pandemic. They demonstrated values of social equity, sustainability, and solidarity, serving marginalized sectors and communities, as well as social entrepreneurs and frontliners. They showed how empowered small producers have achieved food security and resilience. They have showed the pursuit of social innovation and creatively utilized ICT and social media to be more responsive and to enhance their outreach, showing the way towards community-oriented digital economies. And then they mobilize stakeholders and community assets, networks, and cadres in reaching the most vulnerable populations, including very far-flung areas, bridging digital and social divides. And in some cases, they even disrupted markets for the common good. So, social enterprises as a whole during the pandemic, next slide please, had multi-level responses, yeah? And there were individual and bilateral partnerships that were made. There were multilateral partnerships between and among social enterprises and their social enterprise resource institutions. There were also coalitions, such as the Poverty Reduction through Social Entrepreneurship Coalition in the Philippines, that undertook an action research and continued and pursued their advocacy for a poverty reduction through social entrepreneurship law and program that was needed even more so than before. And over and above that, there have been multi-stakeholder platforms that have been initiated by social enterprises towards inclusive recovery and building back fairer at the national and regional level, and through the COVID-19 social enterprise response and visioning effort that ISEA, the Institute for Social Entrepreneurship in Asia, led. Next slide, please. We were able to actually transform what we're supposed to be. Next slide, please. Social entrepreneurship SDG acceleration. The slide before that, please. Social entrepreneurship SDG acceleration platforms that I was talking about, that we were going to be launching before the pandemic. We were able to transform them through a process into platforms for inclusive recovery and building back fairer. And I just wanted to introduce you to these 5 platforms. One is Women's Empowerment, Livelihoods, and Food in Agricultural Value Chains, which we call We Live Food platform. Decent Work for All in Sustainable Value Chains. Health for All. Rural Revitalization, Youth and Social Entrepreneurship, and Technological Innovations for Sustainable Development. I will not have the time to discuss all these platforms, but I just wanted to give you a sense of one of our platforms. No, the next slide, please. uh, our women's our women's empowerment livelihood and food platform is actually promoting a set of benchmarks for transformational partnerships and women's economic empowerment in agricultural value chains. And we have a very strong engagement with ASEAN, and we have a strong constituency among ASEAN social enterprises. We're also engaging now SMEs as well as corporations to become transformational partners of the poor, as well as to promote women's economic empowerment in agricultural value chains. And the benchmarks for transformational partnerships and women's economic empowerment has 8 elements. It includes appropriate technology and community-based and oriented innovations, the small producers getting a more substantive share of value created over time by having them move up the value chain. They're strong in relation to food security and resilience, empowerment of small producers, stewardship and sustainable consumption and production, as well as sustainable agriculture, the combination of transactional and transformational services, women's participation and empowerment, and measurable outcomes of transformation. We actually created scorecards of using these 8 elements of success in engaging women and men small-scale producers in Southeast Asia. And the scorecards can actually assist SMEs, social enterprises, corporations, and agricultural value chain players to transform their operations to becoming more transformational partners of small producers and to actually become enablers of women's economic empowerment. And in ASEAN, we also have an ongoing advocacy to actually enshrine a set of guidelines for transformational partnerships and women's economic empowerment in agricultural value chains, which are a set of enabling policies as well as incentives for the practice of the benchmarks for transformational partnerships and women's economic empowerment in agricultural value chains. Next slide, please. So the multi-stakeholder platforms that I mentioned have been launched and presented at a conference that we co-convened with ESCAP in September 2020, and that's what actually a session where we actually had Dr. Sita there, and the multi-stakeholder platforms are intended to promote the recovery of social enterprises towards leaving no one behind and building back fairer. No? And they're meant to be learning exchange and capacity development platforms. They're meant to project collective impact. They're meant to engage governments for changes in policy and programs, as well as collaborative endeavors. And they're also meant to promote partnerships towards cross-sectoral collaboration. Next slide, please. The Sustainable Development Goals that the stakeholders from the 5 platforms shall be contributing to are the Sustainable Development Goals linked to Pandemic Recovery Plus. We say plus because we're going beyond actually the 9 SDGs that were identified by the UN, including gender equality. No, so these are no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, reduced inequality, decent work and inclusive growth, inclusive and sustainable industrialization and innovation, responsible consumption and production, sustainable communities, climate action, women's empowerment, peace, justice and strong institutions, and partnership for the goals. So I just wanted to share with you. That's my last slide. I just wanted to share with you that social enterprises are a very important partner of governments, the business community, and civil society in the recovery process towards building back fairer. Thank you.